This presentation looks at the major changes in Canada from the time of the conquest to responsible government in the years from 1760 to 1848. Before the conquest, the French territory in New France had reached its peak. Unfortunately for the French, they were also overextended and had a small number of people in a very large territory compared to the English colonies that had far more people in a smaller territory. 3 years after their surrender to England, the French reluctantly signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763. By this treaty, the French lost all of their possessions in North America, except for the small islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon, which are right off the coast of Newfoundland. In the same year of 1763, the Royal Proclamation created the tiny province of Quebec. There was no longer an entity called New France, and this province of Quebec now belonged to the British Empire. Murray's instructions from England were to assimilate the French, but Murray stated, "How in God's name am I supposed to assimilate the French when they represent 99% of the population and the English only represent 1? Besides, the French are a most noble people, and Quebec must remain populated by the French until the end of time." Murray then lost his job and was sent immediately back to England. Sir Guy Carleton was Murray's replacement as governor. Carleton was worried about a storm brewing to the south in the 13 colonies, and he wanted to keep the local French population loyal in case there was to be a war with England. So he passed the Quebec Act in 1774. The French Canadiens had to choose between being ruled by the Americans, who were anti-French and anti-Catholic, or the British. It was the Quebec Act of 1774 and all of the concessions that it gave French Canadians that made them decide that they were far better off with England. The Americans were really angry that their mother country had given full Catholic and full language rights to the French in Quebec. But the last straw that broke the camel's back was when the Quebec Act gave the entire Ohio Valley to Quebec. This helped usher in the American Revolution. After the arrival of the Loyalists, the English population went from 1% all the way up to 10%. The demands of the English for an assembly could no longer be ignored, and in 1791 the Constitutional Act was brought in, creating Upper and Lower Canada and giving the vote for the first time. The growing English population inevitably led to more friction with the French majority. The French were angered that the English controlled both the purse strings of the colony as well as having all the power in the government. In 1837, a group of French rebels called the Patriots fought a series of battles against the English army and were easily defeated. Durham's recommendation of uniting Upper and Lower Canada into one, and more importantly, bringing in responsible government, helped usher in the democracy that we enjoy today in Canada. Unfortunately, that was somewhat undermined by his recommendation of assimilating the French. This was based on Durham's misguided belief that the French were somehow inferior to the English. Durham went on to say, "There can hardly be conceived a nationality more destitute of all that can invigorate and elevate a people than that which is exhibited by the descendants of the French in Lower Canada, owing to their retaining their peculiar language and manners. They are a people with no history and no literature." The Union Act of 1840 brought in one of Lord Durham's recommendations by uniting Upper and Lower Canada into the province of Canada. Durham's recommendation for responsible government would not be brought in for several more years. Responsible government was finally established in 1848, when the reformers Robert Baldwin and Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine won 2/3 of the seats in the Assembly. The governor of the colony lost all of his power, and went from the role of most powerful individual to a representative of the monarchy, which is the role of the Governor General today.